So sometimes people say that it's true that people are, the families are richer, but that's because now you have two incomes to support a family, whereas previously it only took one income to support a family. That's kind of true, but let me show you a graph here first. So let's look at leisure time. So how much time, there's work that you get for pay, and then there's work that you spend in the house, like domestic production. Okay, so what we're looking at here is a graph of time that people are not sleeping, they're not working for pay, they're not doing domestic production like cooking or cleaning, and then they're also not grooming. I think is actually taken out of here as well. So this is pure leisure hours when people are doing things for fun, right? And what you see is, if we look at 1965 to 2015, leisure hours for both men and women have increased. Okay, so leisure hours for men, they already had 2 hours a week extra leisure in 1965. It actually got to parity in 1975, but also increased. Further increased to 1995 with parity, and then since 1995, something kind of unusual happened. Women actually reduced leisure hours, and men did too a bit, but not nearly as much. And then since then, men's leisure hours have increased quite a bit as well. I'm not 100% sure why this is, but I think it might have something to do with the fact that men are tending to work less, and women are tending to work more, actually. So labor force participation among men is higher than women now. Among women is higher than men now. I should be careful. It's not higher than men, but it's growing faster than men. So you might say, why do we have more time for leisure? Or another way to say it is, why is it that women are working more? It's because the time that you need to maintain your house has actually been decreasing significantly. So here's 1890, and we just looked at a graph that started here in 1960, but let's look at 1890. This is the hours of housework per week, right? So let's look at the dark black line first, and you can just see that this is just steeply declining. It started with 60, goes all the way down, and it continues decreasing at a slower rate, all the way down to here, where it's something like a little bit less than 20 hours a week. So it's decreased by 1/3, and it's not going to be. If you take a moment to think about why it might be that we spend less hours maintaining our homes today, the reason is simply that things like washing up or washing your clothes just take way less time than they used to. And the reason why is because of appliances. So here's the percentage. The right axis here is the percentage of households that have these different appliances. So you can see that, I believe this is in the United States, but running water, it went from 15% in 1890 up to basically 100% by 1965. Interestingly, my grandmother, actually my grandmothers on both sides didn't grow up with running water, but my grandmother, who lived in rural Wisconsin, a rural part of the United States, she bought a new house in the 1940s, and it didn't have running water. Still only 70% of households had running water in the United States in 1940, which is pretty crazy. Stove, what is this one? Microwave. Look at the shoot up here, microwave. It went from 0 almost in 1970, something close to 0 in 1970, to basically everyone now has a microwave. I've noticed sometimes in Denmark, it's not that uncommon. I think some people some of my colleagues have houses without microwaves. I can't imagine how they do it. We have a microwave, and we just use it almost every night. To heat up some leftovers from the day before, we make something new, and we have some leftovers from yesterday. Washing machine, is a little bit lower, and here in Copenhagen, still you can see those laundromats around. But so that's the reason why. The reason why women are working isn't because it takes two incomes to maintain a household. The reason women are working is because there's been a dramatic reduction in the number of hours it takes to maintain a house, And what do you do with the rest of the time? Well, some of it you're going to spend on leisure, but since people are more productive, they choose to actually work in order to enjoy their leisure more by having more money to spend during leisure hours. Another thing that I should say, I can see the next one is but, so I can say it here as well, is that until the 1960s, women's opportunities in the labor market were also not good. So the outside option of working and then paying someone to do your chores, that would have been impossible in principle, but women were basically excluded from the labor market. So that changed in, say, the 1960s and 70s. So now women work more. Okay, yeah, fine. But that's just consumerism, right? That's just about buying stuff. It's like, yeah, okay, you showed us that we're richer, but who cares if all we're getting is, new doodads and stuff that's not important, right? I mean, is economic growth really important? Well, you know what? It's not just stuff. It's stuff that matters too. Here's a graph of child mortality. Okay, so the one we have records going back the farthest, the country we have records going back the farthest for is Sweden. Church records about people's children when they were born and when they died. So this starts in 1750, and what you can see here is this percentage of children dying before the age of 5. So something like, on average, 1/3 of children would die before the age of 5 until 1820. All right, and then here, this is 1/5. All right, let's say 1/4. 1/4 of children would die before the age of 5 until 1880. And then there's this very quick drop. So, I mean, you are still young. You don't have a family. Most of you, some of you do. But I can tell you I have a child. I just can't imagine why anyone would even have children if they knew that there was such a high chance that they would die. If you had several children, you just expect, at least one or maybe two of them to die before the age of 5. It just sounds terrible. That has just petered off all over the world to essentially zero. Even in the relatively poor countries of the world, Ethiopia, which is actually not the poorest of African countries, it's actually a country that's not that poor in sub-Saharan Africa. But, that's also dramatically dropped off here. It would be true for any country we'd want to graph. So it's not just stuff. It's also things that matter as well. So here's a similar thing, number of deaths of children under the age of 5. Why were they dying? So deaths from pneumonia, deaths from diarrhea, deaths from various causes are also all dropping since the year 2000. So this has continued to drop in the last few years. So here's child stunting, but now I've screwed up So here's child stunting. If you don't get nutrition when you're a very young child, then you'll have something called stunting. You notice it if you go to countries. I've spent some time in China, for example, and what you see really is that people that are older are smaller. So there's a stereotype that Chinese people are smaller. There used to be a stereotype like that, but if you look at the younger generation, they're not particularly short or small. They're actually much larger. The reason why is because they're just no longer stunted. So you can see like incredible things like this one here. 70% of children in Bangladesh were stunted in 1985. Today the number is more like 40%. Still terribly high, but falling. And it's falling all over the world, particularly quickly in China, of course. And then it's a similar picture, undernourishment. So what percentage of people are hungry, if you like, or undernourished in the developing world? In 1970, we've got 1/3. In 2015, it's still, again, a terrible 15%, but it's fallen a lot, and it's fallen particularly in East Asia, where incomes have really risen a lot, mostly because of the takeoff of China. And then something very closely related, famine, something we heard about. I remember growing up hearing about famine in, I believe it was actually, no, this is terrible, but I can't remember. I think it was Ethiopia actually in the 1990s had a famine that I remember hearing about. But I mean, it was so much more common. This is famine deaths per 100,000 people per decade, and you know, it wouldn't be that. And so this is an absolute number, right? The population of the world is growing during this period. This is this is per 100,000 people, so it's like a percentage. But in any case, you know, it wouldn't be, so per 100,000 people, 1,000 is 1%. So in any given decade, you know, you might have a 1% chance in the 1870s of dying of famine, which sounds like a pretty terrible way to die. And here it's not too far away from 1% in the 1920s. So, you know, that is something that is just almost unheard of for this modern period. And then here's calories. This is related to stunting, right? So people are getting more calories in the world, especially. We have data since 1950. Calories per person per day is going up a lot. China, China's had incredible growth. So in 1950, China was an extremely poor country, and today it's a middle income country, so people are much, much better off, much healthier. And then finally, I think, exactly, the last slide in this section. Finally, life expectancy. Well, life expectancy has been growing all over the world. One thing you might say, this starts at 1760. We go to 2018, probably is the last year of the data. And what you see is the life expectancy at birth in 1760, and basically in the world until the mid-19th century was around a little bit less than 30. Today in the world, on average, life expectancy is almost 70, and of course Europe and the Americas are higher than the rest of the world. Even in the 18th century, they already started to take off relative to the rest of the world. But even in Asia, especially in Africa, life expectancies have also been dramatically rising at birth. One interesting thing to talk about is we have a constraint on our time. In one day, you only have 24 hours. It doesn't matter if you're rich, if you're poor, one day, 24 hours. You get 24 hours in the day, right? That budget constraint is very, very strict. Nothing you can do about it. You get 24 hours a day. But what this graph says is that actually we've added a lot of days to our lives. So just as we've become richer, we've also become richer in time. We've added time to our lives. More time. So we now have more time. Each of our lives has more time in it. I think I will stop there and then take the next subject in the next video.